Was it a hard call to leave?
No, it wasn't a hard call to leave. And then the day that I left, I mooned the audience. Do you remember that moment?
I do remember that.
I was like, what would be appropriate?
Let's talk about paying for it. So the Chester's graphic novel came out in 2011. Your character in your film is Sonny. In the graphic novel, which I read this morning, your name is Sook-Yin Lee, and it's really you. When you first read Chester's graphic novel, what resonated with you about it?
Yeah, I mean, Chester Brown is one of the best storytellers, regardless of any medium. His medium is comics, and I love his work. He had been delving into autobiography for several years, and when Paying for It came out, not only was I the person in his life that was a sort of catalytic moment when I decided to ask him if we could open up our romantic relationship. That's like the first scene of his graphic novel. That was very interesting to see, that slice of life of which I was privy to and witnessing. But more than that, the story resonated for me because I think, I had been involved with the movie Short Bus, which was a real groundbreaking LGBTQ two-spirited film that, I was an actor in it. And it was a bright light in my consciousness. And I had been dealing with these kinds of themes and in my own work with Year of the Carnivore, sexuality and intimacy. And when I read Chester's book, there is a parallel that he draws in his argument, which is essentially the book is a political tract for the decriminalization of consensual sex work. He has all kinds of compelling arguments within this framework. And one of them draws a parallel between gay liberation and the struggles of consensual sex workers to find rights within their work. So to me, that really resonated.
I want to get into Chester's advocacy for sex workers and his and how this is in some ways a queer film, even though this is a hetero relationship. But I want to go back to, I've never had the experience of anyone ever writing a graphic novel about a relationship I was in. So how was that? How was reading it for the first time and going, oh, I'm in here?
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. I'm a big fan of Chester.
Yeah.
And like I said, he had been working in autobiography before. So I was like, yay, I made it in one of his comics.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh, this is complicated. Oh, geez. Okay, let's go.
Did you learn anything you didn't know from reading it?
Definitely. I mean, I was there. Like, he does chart the course of our life together. I was a young person in Vancouver. Many of my friends were, opening up their relationships and, wondering about how to be in the world and be able to love beyond a kind of like ownership of a, one-to-one monogamous relationship. Yeah. I had just gotten the gig at MuchMusic, and like, Chester's a real nerd. He's very socially inept. He loves to draw. He's a loner dude. And I just got this gig where I'm going to gigs and meeting all sorts of neat people, playing shows, very extroverted. And I'd turn around and I'd be like, where's Chester? And he'd be like in the corner of a concert reading a book.
Right.
So our trajectories were going in different ways. And then I started developing crushes on people. Mm-hmm. And I could never, get beyond a few years in a relationship at that point. So, Chester was my family and I loved him so much and I couldn't imagine breaking up. So I was like, hey, what do you think about opening up the relationship? And at first he was like, And, he's a person that's very much a person who respects and desires freedom, and so respects other people's choices. And he's like, is this what you really want? Do you want to break up? No. Well, is this what you want? Yeah. Okay, well, let's try it. And so we did, and I started to go on dates, the culturally approved of model. And Chester remained celibate for a couple of years because A, socially inept, B, unable to flirt, C, not interested in being in a relationship. And we kept living in my tiny 11-foot wide row house together. And so it wasn't until a couple of years later when he was like, the option of paying for sex became a possibility. And he's a very logical guy, and he was like, okay, okay, how much?
Yeah, he budgets out this year. Yeah.
I pay Sook-Yin way more than that every, just in our life support. But I could 4 times a year, like this sort of logical thing. And then he started to explore that arena in the late 90s.
Right.
And the book is really myopically from his perspective. He had the wherewithal to treat the sex workers that he visited with respect, and he was an excellent tipper. Like, he is an example of the the best client you could be. And I hope that other people who are pay for sex look at him for a lead. You must behave yourself and be very responsible and respectful and tip well for their time. So anyway, but he also witnessed the sort of lack of labor rights that sex workers have to contend with in their life. They're subhumans. And so they cannot call on the police, or they have no laws to protect them. And so he, he had done the biography of Louis Riel as well. So he's a very moral person. So this was great grist for him in terms of, writing a graphic novel that addressed some of these concerns that he wished to share with people.
So here's where I get with the film. So I understand why you wanted to do the film now, and I appreciate your reflection on the book being the strangeness of a book being written about you, but also how normal it felt and how usual it felt given what you knew about Chester. But when it comes to making the film, I read the book this morning, and I'd say the back, I don't know, I want to say the quarter of the book maybe, is an essay advocating decriminalization of sex
his
work.
Appendices.
And there's intense, and I don't say very intense, very detailed arguments of stuff like legalization versus decriminalization.
Yes.
All the arguments against sex work and the arguments for sex work. You had to make a very entertaining film here. As much as just a film about advocating for sex work. How do you balance that?
I mean, he's an egghead. I'm not an egghead. He's logical and grounded. I'm a hothead, and I like a good story. At first I thought, okay, this is a brilliant book. I'm just going to, there's his storyboard. I'll just verbatim transcribe the whole thing.
Right.
Boop, 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 boop. We looked at it and we're like, oh my God, this is terrible. This is a great comic book, a graphic novel, but as a movie, it does not work. It was too episodic.
You transcribed it
into Final Cut script software.
Right.
Okay, boop-a-doop, boop, boop.
Yeah, right.
That was my boop-a-doop soundtrack of boop-a-doop.
That
boop,
wasn't
boop,
studio
boop, boop.
trickery. That was real sound effects. That was just,
That was me working.
That's called Foley art.
So it was very clear to us that it wasn't they're different mediums. And Chester, in order to protect the identities of the sex workers, he oftentimes framed their bodies, anything that would indicate who they were physically or any of things they shared. He did not include. He wanted to protect their confidence, their privacy,
anonymity.
And same with me. All of his friends that he depicted, he was really a light on the touch. I'm like, I was only in there. I'm happy to be in there, but I was only in there for what? He's like, but I was protecting you. I'm like, oh, okay. But I wanted to in the movie bring the sex workers to life. I didn't want to just do a myopic perspective from a dude's perspective wandering through the city. I mean, it is a very interesting perspective, and the political aspects of his argument in the appendices are oh so important, but I didn't want to have them be in the front. I needed to figure out how to address the most important aspects of his argument, but then it also couch it within compelling characters, flawed people who go through transformations. There's a 3-act structure in a movie. I wanted to tell a good story that was true and tender. I'm interested in relationships. I didn't want to bash people over the head with a politic. I wanted to be able to present questions and have people debate amongst themselves about what they think relationships constitute, if there's wiggle room in their own lives, what they think of paying for sex. There's so many different, very grist-worthy conversations that are especially important for this particular time. So how to do that? It was a very difficult puzzle to solve. It took me years. I wrote one draft where it was all him ranting. And it was like, this would have worked in the 70s as a French New Wave film, Jean-Luc Godard, mwah. But this time it's not going to work. In the book, he saw 32 people. I couldn't do 32. It was like, and then, blam. Big essay in the end. So to me, I had to distill, figure out what were the most important aspects of the story, create that in the structure, but then obscure it by creating on top of that the narrative. So all of those things you feel all of those things, but you're compelled by the story.
Our producer, Lee's, who's sitting out there right now, said to me that, as a queer person, even though these are straight relationships, straight hetero relationships, both between you and Chester, between Chester and the folks who engage in sex work. She said it still kind of felt like a queer film to me.
It's totally a queer film.
So talk to me, and you said Chester made the point, and you sort of make the point that I guess through the lens of the film, talk to me a little bit about how the film makes the point that advocacy for sex work is advocacy for queer liberation.
Yeah, so bathhouse raids
Yeah.
in Toronto. The police would raid them.
Yeah.
Very similar with brothels.
Yeah.
So, raiding brothels.
Morality police.
And criminalizing being gay.
Yeah.
That's a no-no. And then criminalizing consensual. We're talking also about, and I'm so happy to be here. You know what? This marks progress too, because the CBC has always been very moralizing when it comes to sex work.
Right.
Oftentimes, it would be very common that you couldn't even talk about this kind of thing without conflating it with sex trafficking.
Yeah.
Sex trafficking is wrong. That's against people's freedom. It's it's slavery. It against people's will. We're talking about grown-up people making the, agreement to have this exchange. And so, I'm glad that we can be here, that you're asking me these questions. So thank you so much.
I'm so happy to have you here. So talk to me more about that, about how Chester saw this and you saw this as both a film about queer liberation and about sex work.
Yeah, so it's a similar struggle. Society maligns either A, being gay, or B, sex work on a moral kind of ground, and creates laws that criminalize both. And then gay liberation coming out of that, being able to not to fight off the authorities and to change laws so that you can marry a same-sex person. That's a huge, huge progression. And so now we have Belgium, who last month, big sex work decriminalization in Belgium, sex workers, consensual sex workers now can have paid leaves of absence.
They have the ability.
Well, they have dental rights now.
Yeah.
So that's an example of progression.
Yeah.
And we can follow suit. Like Valerie Scott was one of the sex workers that I really leaned into for talking to about her experiences and talking about her not only work experiences, but she's an activist that, along with two other sex workers, went to the Supreme Court of Canada to strike down anti-prostitution laws and won provincially and nationally in the Supreme Court of Canada. Huzzah! It was a great victory. No. What happened is the government at that point, the conservative government at that time, they said, okay, you win, but we're enacting a new law, and that is to criminalize the Johns. And that's where we sit now. So essentially, you can have a bookstore full of books, but you can't sell the book. So it still puts people in harm's way. I talk to sex workers who they can't even have a charge card. How can you even live in the world without a visa? Because you're kind of a citizen, not unlike so many people that aren't acknowledged in this society.
Aren't given the full rights of every other citizen.
And it's difficult work. Can I bring to light that not all sex workers are victimized, and not all Johns are vile. There's much more nuance than what we see that, in the media, in our movies, in our expectations. And again, it's not just about sex work. When you see the movie, it's about relationships.
Yeah. What was it like for you to go back to this time in your life? You had to travel back in time in your memories a little bit to make this thing.
And when there I was being this young feminist in Vancouver, like, oh, I'm cool, I'm political, I'm into opening up relationships. When he really told me, I was like, cool. But inside I was like, oh my God, what did he do? I was ignorant. I needed to, in my own life, re-educate my ignorance.
Yeah.
And to his credit, he walked me through. And when I could hear his perspective and what he was learning, then I could not help but understand that. But at first I was really jealous, and I was afraid of losing him. And we did have to, in our own relationship, navigate those things with a tremendous amount of care and love. And so going back to retelling this, I think that there was enough time between my young person and now. Like I said, it took me years it was a confounding adaptation.
Right.
It would bug the heck out of me.
Right.
And I'd have to lock it in a drawer and ignore it for a couple of years and work on other stuff, revisit it and see it with fresh eyes. I really couldn't uncover the puzzle of this graphic novel. I knew I wanted to do it, but every single iteration that I did was not working.
Right.
And so it wasn't until I went, oh, I saw a little detail. Chester saw a sex worker on my birthday? Oh my God. And then I was like, oh, all these, he didn't even, what? Huh? And then I was like, oh, if I just expand the canvas a bit more and illuminate
your own feelings towards it, how
and
you were feeling in that moment.
While he was doing his stuff, I was doing my stuff.
Yeah.
Both of us making big mistakes.
Yeah.
Making choices, doing unusual things, having to pay the repercussion, making discoveries, and navigating our own relationship. So then I was like, okay, I can hang a lot of these ideas on that without being didactic or like being overtly kind of bossy politically with the material, letting it breathe and bringing some of these questions out there.
And bringing some of your own story in there.
I had to, because he's being very vulnerable. And so I had to like bring my stuff.
Well, let me just say that one of the most exciting parts of the film for me is those moments. So it's not MuchMusic. It's called Max Music. And Sonny, or this is the younger version of you.
Yeah, I didn't want to call her Sook-Yin like the book because she's kind of a mixture, an auto-fictional. Like, I knew that I brought things from my life, but then I would sort of fictionalize them. I knew that Emily Lay, who played my alter ego Sonny, would bring her interpretation.
But kind of sounded like you. Did you give her voice? Did she watch old videos of you and Much? And do?
Yeah, the great thing about making a movie based on what you've experienced is like if the art directors are like, "How do you do this?" I'm like, "Here's a photo.
Yeah.
Here's the box that we used to."
She kind of sounded like you.
She's got the alto for sure.
Yeah, and I recognized some of the outfits as like stuff you would wear when you were on MuchMusic.
They were the outfits that I wore. I was like, here.
Really? Out of your closet?
Yeah, and I shot in my house. And then I phoned up Moses Neimer, who's the guy that hired me at MuchMusic. He's the only guy in town with a studio, a TV station. I'm like, Moses, can I have your TV area for if you come in on the weekend? Yes.
Does he know he's kind of in this film?
Yeah, I saw it. Well, okay, that's not him.
Okay, so
there's
let me break this down. So I would call this the subplot. And as much as I was fascinated by Chester's story, as a 90s, 2000s MuchMusic 8 hours a day guy that I was, and you were so crazy important to me growing up watching you on TV. So the film deals with this shift that happened on MuchMusic, that you come in as host of The Wedge, I think, and you come in and you're doing daytime, but you're doing a lot of alternative music. And Much is just
indie.
Much is just playing indie and alternative music. But like I remember that. I remember MuchMusic switching slowly, little by little, and eventually the Backstreet Boys are on.
Yeah.
And no shade to the Backstreet Boys, and no shade to B44, and no shade to NSYNC, and no shade to 98 Degrees. But I remember watching you, who had introduced me to, again, Thrush Hermit or Hardship Post, or I'm only mentioning East Coast bands for some reason, but you know what I mean,
yeah,
like
sure.
alternative music. All of a sudden saying, here's 98 Degrees and here's the Backstreet Boys. And your character in this film is struggling. You are struggling with this. Did that really happen?
Of course, yes. Yeah, so I was sort of like the poster child for alternative underground culture when the year punk broke.
Yeah.
With bands like Nirvana and so forth.
Yeah.
So they were very smart to hire me, and it was great. It was a very free world. I could do all kinds of crazy stuff, live TV. It was radical. I could like get a slow zoom into my armpit, and the crew was like, "Sure, let's do it."
Yeah.
I'd pretend that I was dead on the sidewalk in front of on Queen and John to see what would happen during rush hour, and people would walk over me. So it was like really fun, as just like doing all kinds of social experiments, live TV, filling hours, showing the audience, this is how you relieve trapped gas. You put your bum in the air because hot air rises. It's like a Lee family tradition or secret. Yeah. And people still to this day are like, oh, when you did like visceral recall, total recall for these moments. So it was really fun. But then I was there for like 6 years, and then culturally things shift. Then it was like, I saw and witnessed an increase in corporatization. Moses left, other people came in, it got sold, and just like many other, manifestations of culture, it had the same evolution. Just as gentrification of our cities were developing, that I also address in the movie. It's kind of like, it's not just a nostalgic look at in the 90s. I show a lot of skyscrapers and buildings being demolished. It's really kind of a hint at the evolution of our cities, but also the evolution of that little paradigm called MuchMusic.
Yeah.
And it did become much more corporate. And suddenly it was like, Sook-Yin, can we send you out to cover the Colgate DJ Challenge? And I was like, oh God, hang my head low. This is not why I got in here.
And was it a hard call to leave?
No, it wasn't a hard call to leave. And then the day that I left, I mooned the audience. Do you remember that moment?
I do remember that.
I was like, what would be appropriate? That. Well, I think pulling my pants down and mooning the audience. Hey, Rick the Temp, do you want to join me? Sure. And then, so we both did that.
I remember.
And then I saw the footage and I was like, that's more than a moon. It's a lot more than a moon. So I just thought, okay, the writing's on the wall. This is not interesting. And it wasn't, I got to meet so many great bands and people. And then suddenly it was like prefab band after prefab band after prefab band. There was a junket that I did with NSYNC that was interesting because it was like tearing apart the whole manufacturing model. And we had like the cameras going when they didn't realize it was going. And I could talk to them about their terror of being chased by young girls and stuff
that's
like
what
that.
I find interesting about the pop
that's
world,
very,
for sure.
very interesting. But, in terms of my work, it was like, okay, I've already done this. I did have to move on. But like I'm trying to couch many of sort of also like DIY zines, alternative culture with regards to comics. So we see the cute like zine culture thing, and then suddenly they're at a Comic Con with like big superheroes all around. So, looking at that trajectory, but then also acknowledging the trajectory of, it was sort of a boys' club in alternative comics, and now it's a field, pretty much dominated by excellent women publishers and cartoonists.
Yeah. Isn't it an interesting film? Because you're right. I see it as a film about sex work. I see it as a film about relationships. I see it as a film about like capitalism, but also about changing culture. Yeah. About what happens when underground culture gets taken over and gets commodified. It's really interesting, Sook-Yin. And the MuchMusic.
And then it's couched in this kind of sweethearted film that
kind
feels
of sweet
like,
little romantic film. But the MuchMusic stuff, it was just love to me. I just loved it.
It was funny because our team, most of the team, they're emerging creators that I met, as an actor making tiny little weird art movies. And I'm like, holy sheesh, you're talented. And so many of them were millennial or Gen Z.
So they were like me who saw you on Much?
No, they were even younger. They didn't even see Much. And they're like, oh my God. They were like, how do we transform this Moses's Place? Because it was like the Maryland Lightstone variety show with all these jukeboxes. And I was like, don't worry. All you need for the look of Much is Rolodex in my head. Exposed brick wall, ladder leaning against the wall, 2 warring, brightly gelled lights, a carpeted wedge for me to sit on, and a big-ass TV. Got it? Yes. Done. Shorthand is very easy to get the look of MuchMusic.
Tell me about why you are interested in relationships. It seems like all this work we're talking about is about relationships. Why is that interesting to you?
I think because I'm confounded by it still. I am confounded by sex, intimacy, and love. I love to love. I hope to have the ability to unconditionally love at some point. I think I felt that with my cat, Oscar. She passed.
You said you would love to have the ability to unconditionally love?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Just like unconditional love is not, it's a love that's pure, that's not about you love me, I love you, tit for tat, or trying to own somebody or having, it's about loving with full heart and without an expectation, with generosity. And I would like to, I am too well acutely aware of when I'm buckled down with fear. And I think there's something about, there's like an electrical current that in order to love, you must receive love, and then you also must give love. And there are so many events in our lives that hurt us, that close us off to that. And our little pit bull is guarding our hearts, ready to bite, pounce on the things that we love.
Just want to point out that's another sound effect that's not from the studio. Sure, there's a little pit bull that's guarding our hearts.
Yeah. So, to be able to love without expectation in return, to care for even your plant friends who you live with, Actually, I have a pretty unconditional loving relationship with them.
But to do that with someone who you need
a
that
human
back
being,
with. Yeah,
yes.
And
so it's confounding. Sometimes I have it in brief moments. The other day when David Lynch passed, his children organized a mass meditation for peace and well-being for everyone in the universe. And I was like, okay, it's 3 p.m. Get down on your meditation cushion. And I began to meditate, and inside my head I was like, please, there be peace, please, peace, peace, please, love, please, love. And then this thing inside my head, I don't even know if it was me. I don't think it was me. It was something else. It was like, calm down, stop begging for peace, just be the peace you seek. And then I had a moment of sublime, just good feeling without words attached to it. And I think that's something that I wish to enact more. And I think that's something that's crucial right now in our lives. The more that I can do that and others can do that, the better world we live. But it's challenging. And so I think that's why I return constantly. All 3 of my films have been love stories. And I
don't want to give the ending of the film away, and I won't, but I'll say that throughout the film, from beginning to middle to end, love and care and love and care and looking after one another is the thing that comes up more than anything else.
Despite the way we really freaking bug each other.
Yeah, loving and caring for one another.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful film, Sook-Yin.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
coming in,
Tom.
man.